My name is Billy Garrett. I'm the interim director for the New Mexico History Museum. I want to welcome you to the History Museum. I've been on the job for all of 6 months, and one of the first things that crossed my desk was, well, what about the Harvey Weekend? And so we got together, and this is a special event for the New Mexico History Museum. We've got support for this particular event through the Museum of New Mexico Foundation. I want to thank them for their help. And although the lectures are free, the dinner, there is a cost for that. And any proceeds, any net proceeds, go to benefit the programs here at the museum. And we deeply appreciate that because this museum, unlike some, is a public-private partnership, basically. The state pays for the building and the staff, but all the programs, all the exhibitions come from donors, supporters, contributions, grants, anything we can do to help make money to keep history alive in New Mexico for you, for visitors, for the communities of New Mexico. So I want to thank you for being here. Special thanks to Stephen Fried. I think he's supposed to be the chief Fred head. And one of the things we did this year was we did a contract with Stephen for him to coordinate the entire event. He's done a spectacular job doing that. We want to thank Stephen very much for the work.
And blame me for everything.
I want to thank Jenny Kimball, right here from La Fonda. She's been integral to the support for this event. Of course, Chef Johnny V has been very much involved in helping set up the dinner for tomorrow. And then I want to thank Jamie Clements and Yvonne Montoya from the Museum of New Mexico Foundation for their help in keeping all this stuff going together. And last but not least, I want to thank all the staff from the New Mexico History Museum for their participation and help in, this is not normal, everyday kind of thing we do here, but it is part of what we are working toward, is to have more activities here, and that just means we got to stretch, because we're understaffed, but we've got a great staff. So I just want to thank you, shout out to the folks, and in particular, we've got some security guys here to help. The two most common questions I get are where are the elevators and where are the restrooms? If you're on this lower level and you want to just be able to walk out to an elevator, you can go through this opening here, right out to the double doors, and there's an elevator there that will take you to multiple levels. If you go through that door and around toward the staircase, you'll find the restrooms on the lower level. If you're on the upper section and you need to use the restrooms, just go out the doors to your left, down the staircase, and around to the right. So they're very conveniently located. We also have restrooms on the other floors, but none on the mezzanine level. And speaking of the mezzanine level, I just do want to mention that, of course, outside the doors up above, we have the Harvey exhibit, fantastic exhibit. And there's a new part to this, what we call the Triangle Gallery, which is tucked in around the back side. There's an exhibition we just opened on the last Friday. It's called Working on the Railroad. It features photographs of men and women who worked on the railroads, specifically on the railroads. The photographs come from the Library of Congress, but the predominant number are actually from the photo archives here at the History Museum. They are spectacular, and there's a very nice narrative that goes along with those. So if you haven't seen that exhibit and you have a chance, stop by and take a look at that. And I hope you have a great time this weekend. I'll be with you the entire time. And with that,
There's a long history here of directors just pointing at me and telling me to start talking. Thank you, Billy. As he said, I mean, Billy was on the job for like 9 minutes when he had to make a decision about what we were doing with the Fred Head Weekend this year. And I want to thank him, the staff here at the museum, the staff at the foundation, LaFonda and so many staff members at LaFonda have worked on this in so many different ways. The ads you saw in PASA were done by the marketing department at LaFonda. Everybody at LaFonda jumps in on this. And here, I'm actually going to advance the slide to tell you that the Fred Harvey History Weekend, or the Fredhead Weekend as we know it, was originally founded and presented by the museum and LaFonda Hotel, and this was 10 years ago. The first one of these was in April of 2010. Obviously, in recent years, we have added the Castaneda and the Plaza Hotels in Las Vegas, Legal Tender in Lamy, the Winslow Arts Trust, and Might Makes Right is my little and Diane's little LLC that oversees this. But it really has become sort of a statewide thing, which is what we dreamed of when we first started this, and it was like a joke almost that one day we would all be together and we would be having dinner at the Castaneda, and the Lamy operation would be reopened again, and Alan and Tina would cross the Arizona border into New Mexico. And the Arizona Fredheads and the New Mexico Fredheads could be as one. And so I think that really has happened. It's a wonderful thing. And so I'm also very pleased with the lineup of speakers we have this year. And I'm going to start my speech so that it can end at some point, and we can have everybody else talk. So I assume some of you have heard me talk about Fred Harvey before. But I assume there's probably some people who have not been to Fred Harvey events. We've actually had a lot of RSVPs from people who are Fred curious. For those of you who haven't heard the story, and I'll also try to give some updates for those of you who have. So the major question of my life over the last 10 or 15 years has been, who the hell is Fred Harvey? Especially for people in the East who only know about Howard Johnson. We don't know about Fred Harvey unless we go to the Grand Canyon and we get flyers about Fred Harvey, and we don't know what they are. So basically, Fred Harvey was a British guy. He came to America in 1853. He worked in restaurants in New York City. He co-owned a restaurant in St. Louis, which was undermined by the Civil War. His partner was a Southern sympathizer and left with all their money. Fred had married. He and his wife had 2 children. His wife died in childbirth in their second child. So Fred went from having a really nice business in St. Louis to losing his business, to losing his wife, and taking care of 2 babies. He moved to St. Joseph, Missouri, and then to Leavenworth, Kansas, remarried, and he got involved in the railroad business, in the transportation business, because that's where trains stopped. So the trains only went as far as the Missouri River at that time and then started to expand. So to be in transportation was to be in trains, to be in wagon trains, and to be in packet boats. That's how things moved along. And Fred's job was to be a ticket agent and then later to be a freight agent, so that as the railroads expanded west, he helped businesses move their stuff back to the east. And people didn't care that much about passengers then. We were just sort of a pain in the neck. I guess we are still kind of a pain in the neck. It is, as is our right. In the train business, the motto was "Freight doesn't complain." But the railroads, in order to get the land grants to build their tracks, had to take care of passengers, and that's where Fred Harvey came in. So Fred Harvey had a whole career, raised 5 kids in Leavenworth, Kansas, and then he had a midlife crisis in his early 40s and decided to get back in the restaurant business. And he saw that the railroads of the West did not have dining cars because the routes were too long, they were too expensive. So there were actually restaurants every 100 miles along the railroads. And these restaurants were uniformly horrible because they knew you were never going to come back. So you came, the food came really late, you took one bite of it, they blew the whistle, you got back on the train, and then they fed the thing to the next person. We actually found stories in the New York Times claiming that the food in the Western train restaurants was more dangerous than fires or train wrecks. And Fred Harvey's idea was that if one train company had better food, people would go on that train, on that route as opposed to other routes. And so he took a small contract to do this in Kansas and then expanded. He started in Topeka, Kansas, in this building up on the 2nd floor there. And he decided that even though this was just a wooden building that wasn't supposed to have very good food, that he would actually have great food, that he would have china, that he would have silver, that he would have fresh food brought in from Chicago, or wherever the train could go. This is actually one of Fred's notebooks with all the lists of, please turn your phones off, and I will too, of some of the things that Fred actually ordered into 1876 to set up this restaurant. And what's amazing is from this one restaurant, which was pretty modest, It mostly was great because you could get fresh meat there that was not scary to eat. And you could get fresh vegetables there, but the food was not very expansive to begin with. The company became this. Now, this may not seem like a lot of locations in a world of Starbucks and Walmarts and everything, but this is the first company in the world to ever have this many locations spread out in a country, and to actually confront the idea of how you run businesses like this in so many different places. And so the Harvey Company was known for its food, for its service, and for its processes, for its ability to be in business in so many places and have very high quality. But it started out pretty modestly. There were a lot of wooden train stations west of the Missouri River, and they just put dining rooms in them. And there were a couple larger buildings that existed. This is the one in Florence, Kansas. But they just took them over and did restaurants in them. They did a very beautiful dining room with, linen, silver, crystal. These were attached to, and in fact, this is the first menu for one of the high-end dining rooms in 1878. This was the first menu in Florence, Kansas, at the Clifton Hotel. A lot of lard those days on the food. There won't be using any lard at the foodie dinner tomorrow night. I can promise you that, unless the vegetarians want lard. Are there larditarians in the world? Anyway, so there's a main dining room. There's also sort of a prototype of the American diner where you had a la carte food, and then coffee. The most amazing thing about Fred Harvey, especially in the earliest times, the coffee in the West was horrible. People used to read it for days, months, and so the idea that you would have freshly made coffee that they wouldn't keep very long was really kind of an astonishing thing. I'm going to show you something that where is it? Oh, no. Oh, Jesus. I updated this. Okay. I'll show it to you later. We got recently from Trainiac an internal sheet from the company that describes like 10 different executives of the company and everything they had to say about every aspect of the coffee. So their commentary on the beans, and their commentary on the roast, and their commentary on the ground, and their commentary on the heating element, and their commentary on how long the coffee should sit before they threw it out, and what it should be reheated with. And so Byron Harvey, all yours great-grandfather, he had all his ideas. Victor Petroso, who ran the Grand Canyon operation, had all his ideas. And they had like 10 executives who I guess got together just to have this powwow. And the whole thing's printed out on a sheet like this big. Actually, we'll bring it here next year. So it was a small operation, a dining room, a diner, and takeout coffee. And Fred expanded the business. As I said, he had 5 kids with his second wife. This is his second wife, Barbara Sally Matas. And they had 5 kids, a son, 3 daughters, and then another son. This is something that we haven't shown here before. We found an autograph book of one of Fred's daughters, May Harvey, and she brought it around in New Mexico during the early 1880s when the company was coming into New Mexico. So Fred wrote this: "My daughter May, be a good girl, and someday you will be a good woman. Your affectionate father, Fred H. Harvey, March 26th." And this is from her brother, your crass old brother, Ford Harvey. He was like about 14 when he wrote that. So the Harvey Company had a couple locations in Kansas, a couple locations in Colorado, and then they came full force into New Mexico. And New Mexico is really the turning point. It is so appropriate that Santa Fe and Las Vegas have become the heart and the center of Fred Harvey history, because the Fred Harvey Company, while it existed in Kansas and Colorado, really became itself in New Mexico. They opened 8 different locations very quickly when they only had 4 before, and they really came very fast. So they came into Raton, Las Vegas, Rincon, Las Cruces, San Marcial, before San Marcial washed away. Lamy, and these were all small locations except for the one in Las Vegas, which was the Montezuma Hotel. So the Montezuma, this is the original Montezuma, which burned down. They built 2 other ones afterwards. The Fred Harvey Company ran this, and the deal with the Fred Harvey Company was that it was a handshake deal for profits only. So the company, Fred Harvey, only made money if there were profits. And so the problem with this hotel, it was very beautiful. It had amazing, it had a zoo outside where deer and antelope actually played. It had a casino. It had an amazing wine cellar. It was actually the largest Queen Anne wooden building in America. The problem was it was a health resort, and at that time, people who went to health resorts were actually really sick. So it wasn't like a wellness resort where you go to get more wellness. It's like where people with tuberculosis, and so the part of the problem, and you can read in the newspaper in Las Vegas, people were complaining, I just came here for a lovely thing. I saw like a guy without a nose. That's not my idea of a vacation. So in fact, this wonderful idea became highly unprofitable. And the people in Las Vegas were really unhappy when I told them that, in fact, Fred Harvey only ran the Montezuma for a year. And so this is, when you're a historian in this area, you are like the docent buster. And docents hate when someone writes a new book that makes them change their spiel. And so my Fred Harvey book, it was not a good thing. But people like knowing the truth. But what ended up happening was, because the Montezuma, Fred pulled away from the Montezuma, and because there was a racial incident in Raton, New Mexico during the same time, when African-American waiters, who were the predominant waiters in New Mexico during that time, got into racial disputes with customers. I mean, it was very tense. A lot of the cowboy customers were former Southern sympathizers. They were really quite aggressive with the waiters, who often carried guns just to protect themselves while they were waiting. So after another racial incident at Raton, it was decided by Fred that they would replace all the African-American waiters in New Mexico with single women, and they would get them from the Midwest, and that's how the Harvey girls were born. And we believe that some of the Harvey girls were employees from the Montezuma after the Harveys left it. It's a little squishy, but we have pieced that together. But that is the beginning of the Harvey girls, and then from that point on, the Harvey girls, there were 100,000 Harvey girls from the 1880s through the 1940s. There were Harvey girls after that, but keep in mind, the original idea for the Harvey girls was that they would be hired centrally in the Midwest and trained centrally and then sent to all the different locations, because especially in the West, they didn't want to rely on just whoever was in town. So what finally happened in the 1930s and 1940s, one that you may have heard, there was a depression in the 1930s. That didn't help. But also, there were enough people in these towns that they could hire locally. So there were Harvey girls up through the 1960s and 70s, but they were hired locally, whereas the original Harvey girls were trained and sent all over the country. So Fred Harvey, while he was the genius of this, actually ran it for a relatively short period of time because he had health problems. And so it wasn't too long where internally people were saying, who the hell are Ford Harvey and David Benjamin? Because Ford Harvey, Fred's son, got involved in the business pretty young because Fred was ill. And David Benjamin, who was Fred's right-hand man, he had been his accountant. He was a Jewish gentleman from London who worked in Leavenworth. And Ford and David Benjamin actually ran the company behind the scenes for a long time, with Fred still giving the ideas. And they ran a lot of it out of the original Union Depot in Kansas City. These are these coffee slides that I told you about. So if you look, this is Byron Harvey up in the upper left-hand corner. Please get away from the lights. Hello, upstairs. Please go around and not through. Okay, no one's listening. So that's Byron Harvey. And look at their description, halfway between pulverized and ordinary, pretty fine, like coarse granulated sugar. These are just guys sitting in a room debating every aspect of coffee. What kind of urn it should be in. They're just obsessed with this. The length of time, please stop walking in front of them. 2 hours in a house, 45 minutes in a dining car. But this is the attention to detail that they had. And as I said, the Harvey Company really came of age in New Mexico. The Montezuma was a mistake for them, a wonderful building, a wonderful business for the Santa Fe Railroad, but really taught the Harvey Company to be focused on these smaller restaurants, and they are where the Harvey girls were born. This is one of the earlier pictures we have of Harvey girls. There are Harvey girl pictures from all over. As someone mentioned earlier, Tom Gable, who was Fred Harvey's postman in Leavenworth, actually came up with the idea for the Harvey girls and suggested it to Fred in Raton. But by the time the Harvey girls were in place, Fred Harvey was not well. He had symptoms that we would now call depression. He had stomach issues that later became stomach and bowel cancer. but what was diagnosed at the time was that he had Americanitis, which was actually a pre-psychiatric disease. There are books written about it, and the cure was for him to go to England and be away from America. And so for that reason, his son, Ford, had to leave college and learn the business, and he learned the business from David Benjamin. And one of the reasons that I always try to point out the different characters in this, just as Arnold was doing, is that I think we tend to focus too much on Fred, like he did everything. And Fred did a lot of cool things. Fred was an amazing leader and had amazing ideas, but his real power was that he could create businesses where lots of people would do his bidding, lots of people would do perfect work and give perfect service in locations all over the country where he couldn't be. This was all run, as I said, out of Kansas City Union Station, and you can see at this point Fred's not a well guy, and he's spending at least half the year in England. This is in the 1880s. But the company is expanding. The railroad expands all the way to California. It becomes twice as big. All those restaurants get Harvey Girls. And then the company grows too big, the Santa Fe Railroad gets in trouble, and Fred Harvey is about to be fired. And this is the part of the story that they never tell in the Santa Fe Railroad version. But in fact, the Fred Harvey Company almost stopped in the late 1880s and in the early 1890s. It was saved in part because of the depression that was all around the white city of Chicago. So one of the things that Fred Harvey tried to do to save the company was to bid on the food service contracts for the Chicago World's Fair in 1893 because he believed that the Santa Fe Railroad would finally get rid of him. They did not get that contract, and the Harvey Company was really just about at the end of its rope when the economy collapsed in 1893. The Santa Fe Railroad went bankrupt. All the other companies in America went bankrupt. And then the Santa Fe could not afford to fire Fred Harvey. So all the things that happened up until 1893 are a wonderful part of the early history of Fred Harvey. And we shouldn't confuse them with what happened later, much of which happened while Fred was dying and while the people who he had brought into the business, like his son, Ford, really did. So after the economy came back in the mid-1890s, it was then that the railroad decided that the Southwest was not just a place to go over, not just the flyover states to get to California, but in fact could be a business in and of itself. The fact that we're sitting here in this room in a city like Santa Fe shows that they were right. And so they changed what they were doing. They also added dining cars to the business. They started adding what were called union stations. Of course, at this time, there were no union stations in the country. Every city had an individual station for each railroad. So Fred Harvey made a deal to take over St. Louis Union Station, which I actually just spoke there 2 weeks ago. They are getting together their Harvey Girl thing. So St. Louis has never paid attention to this, but now they are starting to do it because the people who own the hotel, it's a Hilton, are really into the Harvey Girls. Actually, Jenny and I were there. Their food was pretty good, right? Yeah. And they had Harvey Girl outfits, and we're trying to get them interested. So they started being in union stations. They began in the retail business, which they had not been in before, because the union stations, when they took them over, meant they could run the bookstore, they could run the clothing store, they could run 4 or 5 different restaurants. And so they had to learn that business. And then finally, they decided that in the Southwest, they would build resort hotels. And part of the reason that we think it's so cool the Castaneda is coming back is because there's absolutely no question that the Castaneda was the beginning of the Santa Fe Railroad idea that the Southwest would turn into what it turned into. Someplace that people would come and really get an understanding of America at a much different level than they ever had before. And this was the first mission-style hotel that they built here. It was finished in 1898. It became famous in 1899 because the railroad convinced Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders to have their reunion there. It was just like a business deal, a way to get national attention, to get the national press to come to little Las Vegas, New Mexico, and pay attention to the Santa Fe's new strategy. We actually don't know how active Fred was in all this kind of stuff because Fred was at this point really sick. He had surgery in England. He came back from England and was basically looking at doctors to try to save him. The relationship between him and Ford during this time is really interesting. It's like any father and son where the father wants to try every crackpot treatment there is, and the son's like, is this really going to do anything? Their letters back and forth are so powerful. And while it's happening, the company's expanding. Fred dies in 1901. The company finishes the Alvarado at Albuquerque. And right after it's finished, Ford comes here, and all the Santa Fe Railroad brass come to the Alvarado, and they take a train ride through what will be the tourist Southwest. And they stop at all the Native American pueblos, which have seen very few white people. And they get an idea of what this could all be if more people could come, if there was a way to do it so the Native Americans were being respected. And I mean, they were doing this in business with the Navajo Nation, with the Hopi Nation, who helped them go to all these places. There's actually other pictures of this scene, like hundreds of Native Americans rode with these executives out into the Pueblos to sort of show them what was going on in them. They ended up at the Grand Canyon. This is the first train to the Grand Canyon. And they sat at the edge of the Grand Canyon trying to figure out what the future would be for the canyon. That's Ford on the left, Charles Loomis on the right. They didn't realize that the Grand Canyon would be the cornerstone of the future of the Fred Harvey Company, because after Grand Canyon was open, Grand Canyon was so much bigger than everything else in Fred Harvey, it's really hard to imagine. This is also when Ford's sister Minnie Huckle and her husband John, who was a retail expert from New York, got more involved in the business, moved to Kansas City. And so retail became a bigger part of it. And Minnie Huckle and her husband were big collectors. They were the people from the family who first came to Santa Fe and shopped at all these shops and brought home all the cool stuff. And they were hoping their brother might get into this. And when he came back from this train trip, he decided, and they decided together, that they would make Native American art more part of what they did. They were going to create a Native American art museum. They weren't really sure they were going to sell it. They were going to create a museum. And it was very clear that the future of what their business was going to be was explaining to people the real story of the Southwest, the multicultural story of the Southwest, that really was not known to people. So people give Fred Harvey credit for explaining America to Americans, which is true. But the Harvey Company also explained the diverse nature, especially of this part of the country, to people in a way that otherwise would not have happened. And it was a combination of the Huckles and the other Harvey family members, Mary Coulter coming in, being brought in first to do the interior design on the Indian Room at the Alvarado, later other jobs. Herman Schweitzer, who was their buyer in the Native American art market, little Jewish guy who had started out selling oranges on the trains and became somebody who would ride out into the reservations and buy his own jewelry and also give Native Americans lighter silver and smaller stones so they would make more commercial jewelry. Which might sound bad, but at the same time, he also made sure that everything they made that was art and everything that they had that was art was preserved. So they created the Indian Building, which we always see pictures of today. And the Indian Building was at the Santa Fe Railroad stop at the Alvarado and was where so many Americans found out about Native American life. A couple years later, the entire thing was recreated at the Grand Canyon. They built El Tovar. That's where I always sit when I go to El Tovar. Although I will say, isn't it amazing that they never wanted to put a fence around? I mean, I'm glad they didn't, but it really is astonishing there's no fence around the Grand Canyon, isn't there? These are pictures of El Tovar at the time. And then, of course, Hopi House. And Hopi House was a bigger version of the Indian Building. Not only was it an Indian building, but Indians lived in the building. And whereas the Indian Building in Albuquerque was more Navajo, this was more Hopi. And people lived in it, they created art, they did dances there. And the company grew unbelievably quickly during this time period under Ford Harvey. And Ford had his maxims for businessmen, which he brought together from his dad's old maxims. One of the things that I always thought was interesting was he talked about being committed to complete customer satisfaction, hold consistently to a level of theoretical perfection, he wrote. Because he realized that you couldn't say the customer is always right if the customers didn't have the slightest idea what they needed at the lip of the Grand Canyon. You couldn't wait for them to figure out what they needed at the lip of the Grand Canyon. You actually had to guess that yourself. They also promoted from within. And Fred's classic line, always please the cranks. Never take yourself too damn seriously. And then during this time period in the early 1900s, the company expanded hugely. First into Kansas City Union Station. Ironically, since the company was based in Kansas City, it had never had a restaurant there. So for 30 years it was in Kansas City, you could never eat at a Fred Harvey restaurant. But in 1914, they took over the entire Kansas City Union Station. This is also the time when Ford got very involved in the creation of the National Park Service. I mean, the Park Service was mostly interested in trees. Ford was the one who really had experience taking care of people in the Park Service. They really turned to the Fred Harvey Company for their knowledge of how to take care of people in the parks, which involved not only people who were hikers, who understood how to take care of themselves in the wilderness, but people like me and my wife who never want to get off the front porch of El Tovar, but want to think of that as being exotic and outdoorsy. the turning point for all this turned out to be the 1915 World's Fair. No one had planned this. No one could have known that there would be a world war by the time the World's Fairs in California and San Diego would take place, and because of that, no one could go to Europe. But those World's Fairs were the turning point for Southwest tourism because people poured into the West to go to California, and then they poured to the Grand Canyon. They came into New Mexico as well. And we're having a talk tomorrow with Maria Martinez's great-granddaughter. This is when Maria Martinez became known to the Fred Harvey Company. She and her husband made black-on-black pottery at the San Diego World's Fair with them. So these two World's Fairs were hugely important. And after them and after the First World War, there were ideas about what the company should do, and also the next generation was coming in. So Ford Harvey, keep in mind there are 5 Harvey kids. Ford has 2 kids, the 3 daughters don't have kids, and Byron is much younger. He's just getting his feet wet in the business. Ford's kids, Frederick, who's a World War I flyer and wants the company to get more involved in the airlines, in car business. His sister Kitty, who's an amazing art collector, openly gay woman, one of the only openly gay women in her time period, and wants to be involved in the business. And they're watching it expand. They take over Chicago Union Station, which used to have a big Fred Harvey banner on the side. And then, not too long after, they had a plan. People always say, well, why do people let a company like this that was so tied to the railroads die with the railroads? The Harvey Company actually did not do that. Other things happened. They actually had a master plan that would go on beyond the railroads because the railroad companies would not invest in the next technologies. They did not invest in cars. They did not invest in planes. They believed their business was trains. But the Harvey Company did not believe that, especially Freddie Harvey. Route 66 ran along the Santa Fe Railroad, so they were already serving people in cars. Those cars went very slowly and broke down all the time. It is amazing people even bothered to drive them. I will say that one of my favorite images of Fred Harviness is in the early years of the Grand Canyon. No one wanted to drive to the Grand Canyon. They would bring their cars on the trains to the Grand Canyon so they could then drive them back and forth along the lip of the Grand Canyon and take them home. But the company was feeding people in cars. They were investing in Southwest tourism, which is when they came into Santa Fe. Santa Fe was the last major city in the Southwest that they came into. They all stayed here all the time. They all bought stuff here all the time, but it wasn't on the main line of the train. In the 1920s, they created the Indian Detours, and they took over La Fonda and built up a tourism business here. While the tourism business itself only lasted a few years, what's really interesting about it is it really did lay the groundwork for our understanding of the multicultural Southwest. The writing that was done under the Fred Harvey auspices, that Mary Coulter and others signed, really is the cornerstone of us seeing the way the Southwest is for real. And there's wonderful pictures. And at the same time, they were in the airline business. So Freddie Harvey wanted to be in the first cross-country airline business. He partnered with Charles Lindbergh, with Henry Ford, with many others, to create a business that you would fly during the day, take the train at night, and for this reason, you could get across the country in only 3 days, as opposed to the much longer time it took. And this airline became TWA, but that happened later. Freddie Harvey, of course, was in charge of the food. These planes were little. They were not pressurized. The windows opened. So trying to figure out what food you can serve when the windows are open and your ears are bleeding, and there were a lot of mixed metaphors that they didn't want to just come out and say we have to give people food that won't make them throw up. But it was a job. The original stewards were male, and then they realized they should be women. So that's how stewardesses came into being. They sort of modeled the Harvey girls. And so by the end of the 20s, the Fred Harvey Company was poised to take over the whole world. They could easily have moved west. There were stories in the paper about how they might extend to Grand Central Station and to New York. They were already in Cleveland. They had these huge operations. They were in the cross-country transport business. And then Ford Harvey got a cold, and he died in 6 days. And the family was not prepared for his death the way they had been prepared for Fred's death. And there was a big scramble. His kids inherited all the stock in the company, but his brother Byron, who had been waiting for his chance to run the company, wanted to know why he couldn't be in charge. He had been working in Chicago, mostly with the dining car business. Their sister Minnie got caught in the middle of all this. She and her attack dogs tried to keep things at bay. And so things started changing in the business. Interestingly, Texas and Oklahoma, all those places, stopped being Fred Harvey at this point. but they kept wearing the clothes and serving the food, so nobody noticed. But the Frisco Railroad, that deal was a separate deal, and in the early 1930s, they got out of all of those. It's too bad because some of the pictures from the Frisco, I must say, are wonderful. But they still continue to invest in the company. They built La Posada after the Depression had started. They let Mary Coulter finish it, even though it was unbelievably expensive. We have actually now some of her books with the fabrics from it that are at the Heard Museum. And the railroad also let her build the Desert Watchtower at the Grand Canyon. What an incredible extravagance to build in the mid-1930s when tourism is almost at a standstill. Thank God these things got made. This is also when Membreno China was created. You'll all be getting some Membreno China if you're joining us for dinner tomorrow night, to be served on the Super Chief. Bright Angel Lodge was created during this time. And things were going really well, and then Fred Harvey's son, who was a flyer, died in a plane crash. And at this point, the Fred Harvey part of the company stopped controlling the company. The Kansas City Harveys stopped being in control of the company, and the Chicago Harveys became more dominant. The Chicago Harveys were closer to the railroad than the Kansas City Harveys had been. The Kansas City Harveys were the ones who were trying to diversify the company. And so the Chicago Harveys, who ran an amazing business, it was just a different business. In order to do that, they had to buy out Kitty Harvey, who owned all the stock. And there were many people who felt that Kitty Harvey, a Harvey girl, should own the company, and it should stay in Kansas City. People in Kansas City just wanted the company to stay there. Instead, it ended up being taken over by Byron Harvey Sr. and his 3 sons. Now, every Harvey you see here is a Byron Harvey descendant, because the other Harvey lines did not continue. Freddie Harvey and his wife did not have kids. Kitty Harvey was gay. The 3 daughters didn't have children. So everybody emanates from this part of the family, which took over the business in the late 30s and ran it very successfully for the next 30 or 40 years. They expanded into LA Union Station. Tomorrow we will have Said Moses here talking about saving this room, which so many of us for years have been begging for somebody to save. I mean, the fact that we would have the Castaneda and a restaurant in this room now is something that would have been unimaginable a number of years ago. Company contracted. It was brought back to some degree because the Second World War allowed all the old Harvey girls to get their jobs back and all the buildings to reopen. That's why the Harvey Girls movie got made, because the company was so big at that time. And we're going to hear actually some Harvey Girl-inspired music in a second when I stop talking about this. But after the 1940s, the company contracted. As you can see, most of it was in the Southwest, so it's appropriate that we continue to focus on the Southwest because the parts of it that were in the Midwest got smaller. The company bought El Tovar in the 1950s. They bought La Fonda. That's the reason why they continue to hold those properties, why the Xanterra has to own them. This is La Fonda during the 60s. But it was started getting bleak, as Mary Coulter pointed out, as she watched her buildings being shuttered down. You know, it is possible to live too long. And she did not live to see this, luckily, to see the Alvarado knocked down, a horrible, painful sight, almost as painful as some of the facial hair that was seen at La Fonda and other places, at the handful of places that were still Fred Harvey. Now, the Harvey Company by the mid-'70s did not own these anymore. They had sold out to a large conglomerate, but the family still felt great affection for it, and the people who worked at them who loved Fred Harvey referred to themselves as Fred heads. So I will say that when I first thought of the word Fred head, I thought I made it up because, as you know, I have a second career making up words. But then I realized that, in fact, Fred head had been a very common term at the Grand Canyon because Deadheads had made T-shirts like this. And also I met somebody online today who said they also referred to it as Camp Fred, that the Grand Canyon was referred to as Camp Fred. And what happened basically is while the Harvey Company, as we know it, stopped existing, people who loved the art, who loved all the different access points that the Harvey Company gives you, culinary, visual, architectural, cultural, they started getting more involved. The art collection went to the Heard Museum. Maureen McMillan, who is right here. Maureen, put your hand up. Maureen McMillan in Belen was the first of the local people to say, we have to save this building and do something with it to honor what it was. The Belen Harvey House, I mean, ironically, there's nothing in Albuquerque, and you have the Belen Harvey House right nearby. Maureen was the first. Alan and Tina then bought La Posada. brought it back to life, and also brought the idea back to life that these buildings and this whole legacy could be alive. This was not popular at La Fonda at the time. It became more popular when Jenny got more involved and more control. Thank goodness. I would say it was not the previous owner's fault. They had a little falling out with the Harveys, and I will say that part of the downside of the Harveys when the companies were sold was that the companies that bought them thought that they were buying more than they got. And so there was a little bit of bitterness. And so what you heard Billy talk about in the 80s, no one cared about making sure those Harvey buildings were preserved, is because there was an essential bitterness, and people did not yet really sort of understand that the next generation of this was going to be to preserve this and get past the fact of how the company was sold out. So this was happening in all these different cities, and then I wrote a book. And this is a picture of the talk that I gave here in Santa Fe 10 years ago. So some of you who are here know that when my book on Fred Harvey came out, the cornerstone talk of our entire train tour was here in this building. It had just opened, and the power went out in the building. We thought we blew a fuse, and then we realized the power had gone out in all of Santa Fe. And so we did the whole thing in the dark. Natalie Bontomasi had a Lego flashlight in her pocketbook, which I did my talk with, sort of campfire style. And I think that was really the beginning of how special this was all going to be for the Southwest and how special it was for us. I remember well going to the Castaneda with the thought that, wow, wouldn't it be amazing if one day we were all actually going there like for dinner, like we're going to do Sunday night. A lot of the people here in this audience were there. And so the weekends that we're doing have gotten more and more interesting each year, I hope. Last year, CBS Sunday Morning was here and did a whole show on the weekend. And go. Oh, this is like a big, heavy picture. Go ahead. You can do it. Cool. So what I wanted to finish up saying is this. First of all, the part of what is cool about this whole thing is just the romance of it for everybody and the love of it. And I will admit, my wife and I started coming here to the Southwest in the fall because it was our anniversary. And so we came here for many anniversaries, and some would argue that the only reason I agreed to do a book on Fred Harvey was so we could continue coming here for our anniversary. There are not, some years that your anniversary isn't so romantic. We spent our anniversary today at 3 o'clock in the morning in the Dallas airport, hoping that we would get here in time for this. But what I want to say is we know a lot of people, we've met a lot of people who we are friends with and who really feel close with because of this. And I think that that is part of the legacy of the Harvey revival too. It's not just buildings, it's not just amazing food, it's also people who have a real respect for each other, real interest in each other. You know, we live in Philadelphia, but we consider the Southwest like our second home because of this. And I think a lot of people do, and I think, but a lot more people need to know about this. It is amazing how many we get here, but you know, the number of people who've never heard of Fred Harvey, like these guys talked about today, is astonishing. And every time someone hears the story, they're like, why didn't I know this? How could this have happened in America? How could this have been this popular, and I didn't know this? That is the essence of great history. You know, to be able to bring something back that when you hear about it, you say like, wow, I should have known about this. And it really allows me to appreciate it better. So I think we're really just starting here. We're appreciating 10 years. I hope we're here another 10 years and many more, saving more buildings and doing more of these weekends. And I'm going to stop my slides here and turn over to the next thing, but I did want to finish up. So thank you for giving me the time and for allowing me to do this. And that's that.